Welcome to Lecture 9, which is Jacksonian America, 1850-1840. The previous lecture was on economic changes that covered about 1815 to 1860. This lecture is largely focused on politics, which is not to suggest that the two are separate. In fact, the two intersect and interact in ways that are very important in this time period, because the pace of economic change really helps some people, hurts others, and it creates a lot of political controversy about what should be the right political response to the economy. After the War of 1812, the president elected at the time is Monroe, and he goes on a goodwill tour of the United States, and pretty soon it gets dubbed the era of good feelings, which I'm going to sort of question whether it's really an era of good feelings or not. And this runs from 1816 to 1824. So what's the evidence that this is an actual era of good feelings? Well, there's only one political party, the Republicans, because the Federalists are gone. But against that political party being in charge, it actually breaks into two factions. The National Republicans are basically almost Federalists in their viewpoint about how federal power should be used to promote the economy. So people like Henry Clay would be a National Republican. The old-fashioned Republicans, the party of Jefferson, are eventually just going to call themselves Democrats. This unity of the parties, even if there are two broad groups within it, is marred by the Panic of 1819, which creates, economic controversy and complaints about how the Bank of the United States may have been to blame for people's misfortunes. The fight over the Missouri Compromise leads to debates between Northerners and Southerners about the future of slavery. Fights over internal improvements, whether or not the federal government can spend your tax dollars to build roads and canals, also broke out between the National Republicans and Republicans. And all of these fights are sectional in nature. In many ways, they pit the North against the South against the North. And sometimes the West holds the balance between the two, depending on what's in the West's best interest. The one key development that is nationalist, that says nation building over sectional building, or sectional identity, is the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. Toward the end of Monroe's presidency, he issues this sweeping declaration to tell Europe, stay out of the Americas. That's right, England, France, Spain, Portugal, all you countries do not belong in the Americas. You don't belong in North America, you don't belong in South America, you don't belong in the Caribbean. All of that is off limits to you from now on. So it's this one moment of national spirit, go America, Team America. You could also argue that the Supreme Court's decisions after 1816 also are examples of nationalism or the supremacy of the national government. At the same time, you can make that argument. You'd also say these decisions did arouse sectional hatred, specifically from the South. John Marshall, as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, consistently made rulings that promoted the supremacy of the federal government. And he's not making this up. This actually comes out of the Constitution. There's a part of the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause that says the federal government's power supersedes that of the states in many areas. Examples of where this federal power, this national power is exerted is in Dartmouth College versus Woodward, 1819, which concerned contract law, breaking contracts. McCulloch versus Maryland, which if you had to learn any case of this time period, this would be the case. It concerns the Bank of the U.S. Maryland attempted to tax the bank, and John Marshall slapped Maryland down and said, "You cannot tax the bank. If you tax, that's the power to destroy," and that would say the state would have more power than the national government, and we can't allow that. Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824, which was over interstate commerce. This also comes out of the Constitution. There's a part that says that the federal government governs any commerce that runs between states, not inside states, but between two states. So between Ohio and Indiana, that's federal control, not state control. This is the Second Bank of the United States, chartered after the War of 1812, and the subject of a whole lot of controversy. The bank's design was intended to sort of model stability and power. It suggests classical Athens. The columns and the design almost look like the Parthenon. But for a lot of people, particularly Westerners and Southerners, they felt like this bank was a symbol of economic power, of elites who controlled the flow of money. This is the Missouri Compromise, which we've already looked at in the previous lecture. And notice that we're seeing here the development of a free North and a slave South. As Jefferson said, this awakened him like a fire bell in the night and filled him with terror, foreshadowing, coming later, the Civil War. And then the era of good feelings comes to an end in the election of 1824, an election that featured 5 candidates. One of them eventually dropped out, leaving a 4-way Republican race, so 4 flavors of Republicans. John Quincy Adams won the election, but it was disputed, and the disputed ballots were given to the House of Representatives, as the Constitution says, and they determined the election in favor of Adams. However, there was some shady dealings possibly going on. Not really, but rumors and whispers of rumors. And the shady dealing that supposedly happened here got labeled the corrupt bargain. What this was the accusation that Henry Clay used his influence in the House of Representatives to push people to vote for John Quincy Adams. And because he was a powerful leader of the House of Representatives, he could use his influence to do that. And in return for pushing Adams as president, Henry Clay gets named Secretary of State. Well, what a coincidence that is. Now, this is really probably nothing's fishy at all, but it just looked fishy to a lot of folks, especially since the Secretary of State position commonly was the next president. So not really a corrupt bargain, but it looked suspicious, and so people assumed there was something shady going on. Eventually, this ruins Adams' presidency. He is not able to govern effectively. Southerners distrust him. A lot of whisperings and rumors going on. And his entire platform as president is pretty much not even supported, with the exception of one law in the time period. Here are the candidates in the election. There were 5 originally. John C. Calhoun, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and then William Crawford of Georgia, who unfortunately had a stroke in the campaign and then spent the last few days of it huddled in his bed in Georgia with people telling everybody, oh, he's okay, he's fine, he's just, not feeling well, but he'll get better. He didn't. As you can see from the map, it's a little bit confused in terms of, the sectionalist voting patterns we saw before. This is not quite as clean as a north-south split. Um, and that's because there were 4 candidates by the time the election ended. Jackson technically got 42% of the popular vote and 99 electoral votes. So Jackson probably should have been president. And you see he had support in the South, but also Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Indiana, and partly Illinois. Crawford got Georgia, Virginia, and a little bit of New York. Federalists way up in New England voted for, Jaquaw, John Quincy Adams. I mean, he's the son of a Federalist. He might as well be a Federalist. And then Henry Clay, being from Kentucky, he got Kentucky and Western states as well. So when you've got 4 candidates like this, the map does look a little bit messier. It's not quite as clear a sectional split as, say, the election of 1800 was. One of the key developments changing politics in this early 1820s time period is the development of a new system of parties. Federalists had died out. Republicans kind of split into 2 groups, but they're a little bit disorganized. And Martin Van Buren, a politician from New York, later to become president himself, starts organizing the Democratic Party and really making it into what we now think of as the modern Democratic Party in the 1820s. And he wanted to reorganize it and make it more functional so it could win elections more easily. So what he did was he organized Northerners and Southerners to support states' rights against the Nationalists, aka the Federalists. But we don't call them that anymore. So they supported a states' rights approach, small government, limited government, respecting the Constitution, interpreting the Constitution literally when it suited them. And he created a structure to make sure that people were getting out and voting. So they created a system of political leaders all the way from the top down to the local level to make sure that people were getting out and organized and voting in the election. And it was very successful. They had extremely high turnout of eligible voters in these elections in the 1820s and 30s. They were aided by some constitutional reforms at the state level. Many states were getting rid of the property requirement for voting and extending voting rights to all adult white males, regardless of how much property you had. So there's Martin Van Buren. And here's the famous quote, 1827, "A substantial reorganization of the old Republican Party would restore the alliance of the planters of the South and the plain Republicans in the North, would unite the people against the money power," pay attention to that phrase, it's going to come back, "and work against geographical divisions founded on local interests, or what is worse, prejudices between the free and slaveholding states." That last sentence can be translated into, can't we all just get along so we can win elections? Jackson didn't win in 1824, but he comes back swinging in 1828. And it's a dirty election. It's dirty. Jackson harped on the theme of the corrupt bargain. He accused Adams of being an elitist and out of touch with the common folks. Jackson talked about the need to get rid of the Indians, get them out of the West, out of the way for white people. He talked about opposing special interests, whatever the heck that means. Sometimes politicians just say something that's vague because it sounds good to their constituents, and they don't really define it. He poses the national bank. He's a really deep hatred for banking in general. He talks out of both sides of his mouth. In some places he talks about needing a tariff that's a good tariff. In other places he talks about not needing a tariff at all. So Jackson is sort of like the modern smooth-talking politician, say whatever it takes to get elected, emphasizing, the touch of the common people. And he won. 56% of the popular vote. It's not the best presidential victory ever. That will come later in the 20th century. But the turnout doubled. More people voted in 1828 than they did in 1824. So Jackson saw his victory as he's speaking for the common man, and the common man now elected him president. So he represents their will. He represents their frustrations, their anxieties, their problems, their deep resentments of the world that is changing around them. A world in which African Americans are getting a little too uppity, and which Indians are refusing to move out of the way for white people moving the West, which rich fat cat bankers are manipulating banking to their benefit and not helping common people. So Jackson harps on these ideas and says that he champions what the people really want. You can just imagine if he had a Twitter account, what it would be like every day. The campaign was dirty, as I said. Lots of propaganda. The first cartoon shows Henry Clay sewing Jackson's mouth shut. Jackson was called the backwoods Caesar, illiterate. I mean, he wasn't illiterate. He wasn't exactly the smartest man ever, but he was a lawyer and a wealthy plantation owner. So he wasn't really even a common man. But he had led a rough and tumble life, so he could kind of work the common man angle. One of the most damning things said about him was that he was murderous, that he was well known for his duels and killing people in cold blood. And so the image on the right is the so-called coffin handbill to show how many people Jackson had killed in the course of his lifetime. What horrible, heinous things that he did. And despite this, talk of him being a murderer, he still gets elected as President of the United States. The other rumor that was floated about Jackson was that he was also an adulterer, that he and his wife Rachel weren't legally properly married because she didn't have a proper divorce from her husband. Sadly, that actually broke Rachel's heart, and she died in the election, and that really upset Jackson quite a bit, made him pretty bitter and angry. Here's the vote. Wow, we are back to clean sectional division here, and it's the Federalists up north, old-fashioned Federalists voting for Jaqua, the National Republican, and the South and the West going solidly behind Andrew Jackson. So Jackson forever, the hero of New Orleans. See, that battle did mean something after all. The man of the people. He wouldn't barter or bargain for the presidency. That's a little hint towards the corrupt bargain. Although he's a military chieftain, he deserves the highest praise and dignity because he has earned this from the people. Now, Jackson stands for the people, but he institutes a lot of changes in the presidency that in the long run will turn out to be terrible, really poorly thought out and bad for the functioning of the U.S. government. And the first, and probably the worst of them, is the spoils system. Jackson argued that federal jobs belonged to the president to hand out to whoever was loyal to him. So Jackson really harped on the theme of loyalty to the party, to the president. And he felt like any of these federal jobs, it was his right to give them to whoever he wanted to, regardless if those people had qualifications for them or not. So he awarded these jobs on the basis of party loyalty, and then he supported this argument for loyalty by saying that rotating the jobs with every president was actually good. It brought in fresh blood and fresh ideas. You could sort of drain the swamp, so to speak. And as a result of that, Jackson felt like he was cleaning up the government, as well as rewarding people who had supported him in his campaign. What this actually did was it multiplied corruption in the government, because people were getting selected for these jobs who actually had no business being in them and had no ability for them. And it increased political partisanship by tying the federal government to the political parties. So all these jobs become, the job of being a loyal Democrat. And, you can get to be postmaster or collector of customs for the state of New York. Jackson's inauguration was quite an affair of the common people. The White House was literally mobbed by hundreds of people trying to get in to see Jackson to actually ask him for jobs. They were trying to get in and say, hey, look, I voted for you, I supported you, I'm a loyal Democrat, what kind of position do you have for me? The mob was so crazy that they broke furniture in China, and Jackson actually had to escape outside of a window to get away from them. Jackson did make good on his promise to take the southern Indians and get them out of white people's way. There were 5 civilized tribes in the South. The civilized tribe name implies that they had adopted some aspects of white American civilization. They were sovereign, meaning they were self-governing, because that's how federal law works. Indians are treated as separate nations. We sign treaties with them when we deal with them in this time period. So these are educated Indians. The Cherokee, for example, have their own language, their own newspaper. They have a constitution, their own form of government and laws. But land-hungry white Southerners want the lands that these people live on. And Jackson supports the idea of getting these sovereign civilized tribes out of the way for the benefit of white Southerners. The place where all of this fight is going to start is Georgia. Georgia is the home of the Cherokee and the Creek, but mostly the Cherokee. And in 1830, Congress passed an Indian Removal Act requiring tribes to be moved to the west. The tribes would still have to sign a treaty, agree to sell their land, and then, get the money to be moved to the west. And the Cherokee weren't interested. They just weren't interested in this process at all. So they sued the state of Georgia in 1831, and in a separate case in 1832, there's a lawsuit against Georgia as well. And in both of those cases, it's decided that the federal government has authority over Indians, not states. So Georgia has no power to move the Indians out of its borders. Now Jackson doesn't like that. He prefers states' rights because he's a states' rights Southern Democrat. So Jackson essentially refuses to support the Supreme Court. He refuses to back up the Supreme Court, and instead he nods to Georgia and says, do what you want. Jackson will refuse to protect the Indians in this case, and the Georgians do get rough with the Indians. And eventually the Cherokee are finally pressured into moving to the west, and that starts what you might have learned about that was called the Trail of Tears, 1838. 14,000 Cherokee are rounded up, and on the trip west, 3,000 of them die. A small group of them get to remain in western North Carolina, and there today there is a Cherokee reservation that you can visit there. Here's a famous painting of the Trail of Tears. It's a modern painting, so this is not from the time period, showing the people having to gather up all their things and move west. It was heartbreaking for the Cherokee because they've been told, if you civilize, if you learn white people's ways, you can live in peace and harmony. That's what Washington and Jefferson had told them. And now Jackson's like, you know what? You're civilized. but we don't care. You're in the way of the white man. And Jackson even made a very disingenuous argument, and not an argument that you can't take seriously at all. He said basically Indians would be better off in the West because they could be protected there from the white man. In this political cartoon, it's suggested that Jackson actually cares for the Indian peoples. He's the great white father. So you see all these Indians coming to visit him, and they're sitting in his lap. So the cartoon suggests, a very positive view of Jackson and the Indians, almost a humanitarian view. But if you read the sources from the time period, a lot of people call Jackson out for clearly taking the side of the white citizens of the South against the Cherokees and these other native peoples. In one particular case, Jackson does not follow his states' rights point of view, and that happens to be on the tariff. In 1828, there was a tariff passed to tax foreign imports, and Southerners are pretty angry about tariffs because tariffs don't help them at all, so they call it the Tariff of Abominations. It's a pretty dirty name for it. In 1832, South Carolina decided to take a stand against the tariff and not support it and not collect it. They did this because one of their sons, John C. Calhoun, wrote for them an explanation of why the tariff is bad for the South and why states' rights allows South Carolina to nullify a federal law. In other words, John C. Calhoun is kind of echoing the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, but he's going even further to say South Carolina has the right to ignore a federal law that, like the tariff. So South Carolina says, we're just not going to collect the tariff. We're not doing it. This angers Jackson. It's the one time Jackson is not a states' rights point of view. He gets so angry about this issue that he threatens to go to South Carolina and hang the first nullifier from the first tree he can find. And he gets Congress to actually give him the authority to use force against the South Carolinians to stop them from challenging federal law. And he argues if a state has the authority to not follow a federal law, then the federal government means nothing. That any state at any point in time can simply just disagree with any law. So why even have a federal government? We would be better off back in the Articles of Confederation time period if you actually believe that. In the end, the South compromised with the North on the tariff, and they agreed that they would lower the tariffs every year until they got to a certain level by 1842. So South Carolina backed down. Jackson didn't have to use force. The tariffs were lowered. But no one in South Carolina ever says or rejects the theory of nullification. And that creates a problem for John C. Calhoun because awkwardly, Calhoun is Andrew Jackson's vice president. And there grows to be a rift between the two of them because Jackson is getting reports what John C. Calhoun is up to, and Jackson also dislikes Calhoun's wife, Fluoride Calhoun, because of the way she mistreats other Washington women, particularly one woman in Washington, D.C. So there is very little love lost between John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson because this theory of nullification never gets rejected. This cartoon is meant to suggest that John C. Calhoun was using the theory of nullification to work his way up to treason, civil war, disunion, and eventually become the despot to take over America. And you can see in, in his bloodthirst for despotism, for the crown, he has killed the Constitution and he has killed the Union, e pluribus unum. Jackson makes his most controversial mark over the Bank of the United States. Originally, he promised to leave the bank alone, but he's not very happy with banks overall. And things are going okay until Jackson's opponents ask for a recharter of the National Bank 4 years earlier than they need to. So their charter is going to expire in 1836, but they asked for the recharter in 1832. Well, what's going on in 1832? It's an election year. And Jackson gets suspicious. He thinks that this early request for recharter is a temptation to get him to veto it and then to use it against him in the election of 1832. And he's right. So Jackson calls them on it, and he vetoes the recharter, issuing a very famous and well-known speech about the money power. He argues that the bank represents the wealthy of America who are using politics to benefit themselves. He also makes a dubious argument that the bank's controlled by foreigners. It's not a smart argument at all. It's not backed up by the evidence. And he also argues that the bank really goes against the rights of states. In some ways, he goes back to that first debate over whether the bank is constitutional or not. And so he vetoes the bank and says, I'm not going to support it. He goes on then to win the election of 1832, and that says to him, ha, I vetoed this bank. I won the election. I am the coolest man. I'm the big guy on campus. I can do what I want. So after winning the election, Jackson ordered federal deposits to be removed from the bank. That is, the federal government would continue to pay its bills from the bank's accounts, but they wouldn't deposit any new money into the bank. And eventually, the national bank would run down to zero. So Jackson, in essence, was taking the money out of the national bank. Did he have the authority to do it? No, he didn't. It took 3 Treasury secretaries before Jackson found one who was actually willing to break the law to remove the federal government's money from the national bank. So in essence, this is how Jackson kills the Bank of the United States, because the U.S. government is the bank's largest customer, and without money in its vaults, it can't really do business. Jackson does get in trouble for this. He gets censured on the floor of Congress, but his supporters are so powerful, they're actually able to override the censure and have it crossed out of the House journals. This is the president of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, on the side here. And so when you see cartoons of Jackson fighting the bank, it's often Jackson fighting Nicholas Biddle, the president of the Bank of the United States. Jackson told Martin Van Buren very dramatically, the bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. And he made good on his word. He killed the bank. Here's the map of the election of 1832. You can see Jackson won with 54% of the popular vote, less than his 4 years earlier. Clay was second with 38% of the popular vote. And then there were a couple of other candidates as well. In the National Republicans in general ran a pretty disorganized campaign. Had they been more organized, they might have given Jackson a better run for his money. But he won, second term, and he kills the bank. Cartoon showing him killing the bank, apparently by showing the order for removing the deposits, which has the ability to shoot out lightning rays. and destroy the bank, which apparently is populated by people with devil horns. Here is Jackson attempting to cut down the bank, represented as the classical monster, the Hydra. His weapon is the veto stick. I'd like to have a veto stick. Wouldn't that be cool? Helping him is Martin Van Buren right here, and this is Nicholas Biddle, president of the bank. And another one, Jackson, the frontier pugilist, the frontier boxer. And he's about to throw a good punch at Nicholas Biddle and knock the bank out. The bank war is important, not just because Jackson kills the bank, but because it also spurs the rise of a political party dedicated to hating Andrew Jackson, the Whigs. The Whigs not only hate Andrew Jackson, they hate the results of Jackson's killing of the bank. When Jackson destroyed the Bank of the United States, it could not use its economic power to keep the economy strong, and a massive economic panic breaks out in 1837. So in part because Jackson had killed the bank. State banks failed. States actually default on their bonds, so states that were indebted go bankrupt. Prices rose 50%. There's a 20% unemployment. This is a pretty bad panic. The highest unemployment rate in American history is about 25%, so this is not far off from that. So Jackson basically creates this horrible economic downturn, but he doesn't have to deal with it because the next president is Martin Van Buren, Jackson's successor. And Martin Van Buren did not believe in government intervention in the economy. He told people if the government helps you out, you'll come to depend on the government, and that's not the federal government's job. So basically, people suffer. The federal government does nothing, and the crisis gets blamed on Jackson and Van Buren and their anti-bank policies. Whigs use this crisis, this depression, and hatred of Andrew Jackson to run a campaign in 1840 featuring William Henry Harrison. What's interesting about this campaign is the Whigs learn that in order to win elections, you need a popular person. You need a war hero. What was Jackson? A war hero, War of 1812. What is William Henry Harrison? A War of 1812 hero. And not only do you need a hero, a war hero, to run for the election, you need to emphasize that he is in touch with the common man. So the Whigs basically steal the Democrats' playbook for the election. And there are barbecues, parades, and all kinds of propaganda to suggest that William Henry Harrison is a common man. He's actually not. He's a wealthy slaveholder. But they depict him with a log cabin, like he lives out in the wilderness. They depict him drinking hard cider instead of champagne. And so it's suggested that he's just this ordinary dude that everybody can get along with. And because of those common man themes, and because the economy is so bad, Harrison beats the pants off of Martin Van Buren. And then tragically dies a month after his election because he dared to give his inaugural address in the cold, wet rain, and he got pneumonia and got sick. Here is anti-Jackson propaganda produced by the Whigs. Notice how Jackson is compared to being a monarch, a tyrant who wields the veto to strike down any laws he doesn't like. Look at how he stands on the Constitution, how he's stood against internal improvements, how he has used his authority to make himself the king who reigns over us. Isn't that interesting? Jackson started off as the common man, The Whigs produce propaganda to suggest he's not a common man at all, and then they steal his common man shtick for their own election. This is a cartoon showing the effects of the Panic of 1837. So people in poverty, their families in ruin here, mom and children laying in squalor while dad drinks their hard-earned cash away. These people are jobless, don't have employment. Flour is expensive, can't afford prices. Commerce is shut down. Everything is going wrong. This other cartoon about the Panic of 1837 shows a poor guy who's not made any money and he can't get any work, and his poor family is about to get evicted by these guys who say, "You've not paid your rent." Oh, and the poor little children, "Father, can't I have a piece of bread? I say, Father, can't you get some specie?" And the other guy's like, "I'm so hungry." Oh, so sad. Who's to blame for this? Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. Here's Harrison propaganda from the election to show that he's the farmer, common man. I mean, he's not. He's not any of those things. There were Harrison log cabin plates and cups and saucers. Almanacs that you could buy, calendars. In one of the parades, they had a giant papier-mâché ball that they ran through town. I mean, this was a wild campaign. It also was a musical campaign. There was a song written for Harrison. The song is based on his nickname, Tippecanoe, because he defeated Tenskwatawa at the Battle of Tippecanoe during the War of 1812. And this song goes like this. What's the cause of this commotion, motion, motion, our country through? It is the ball a-rolling on for Tippecanoe and Tyler too, for Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And with them we'll beat little Van, Van, Van. Van is the used-up man, and with them we'll beat little Van. So they actually had their own campaign songs at this time. The Democrats responded with their own song. Rock-a-bye baby, when you awake, you will discover Tip is a fake. Far from the battle, war cry and drum, he sits in his cabin a-drinking bad rum. There is Harrison and his vice president, and more log cabin propaganda, the Ohio farmer. Here's my favorite anti-Van Buren piece. I've seen this in the Smithsonian. It's amazing. It's a little card with Van Buren drinking champagne, because it was rumored in the campaign that he spent all his time in the White House having lavish parties and drinking champagne while poor people were starving to death. So he's drinking champagne, and if you pull a tab at the bottom of the cartoon, it makes his eyes and his mouth change because he ends up drinking hard cider, and he becomes an ugly mug, an ugly face. I just love this. This is one of my favorite pieces. Here is the electoral map showing that Harrison won pretty much most of the United States. Van Buren not getting very much support anywhere except for the South and a little bit of the West. So, by 1840, we have two clearly defined political parties. The Democrats, who believe in negative liberty, meaning the government is supposed to stay out of your business and leave you alone. They oppose banks. They favor agriculture and slavery. They're the party of farmers and the common working men of the North, though actually they hardly ever do anything for the working people in the North at all. And they believe in states' rights. The Whigs believe in positive liberty, which is the federal government using its power to help people and to enable them to be free. They like government support for banking. They prefer industry. They want to see America grow industrially. They favor the middle class. You find more Whigs in cities and urban areas. And they believe in strong central government. So in other words, the Democrats are kind of basically the same as the Jeffersonian Republicans. The Whigs are essentially the same as the old-fashioned Federalists. We've just changed the names and updated the issues they fight over. If you viewed it schematically, it would look like this. We start with the original Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists remain Federalists. Anti-Federalists eventually become Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. The Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans take over the government, but then they split into two groups, moderate and nationals versus old Republicans. Federalists die out and get replaced by a merger of Whigs, who are national Republicans, and old Federalists. And the old Republicans become the Jacksonian Democrats. So that's our political development, roughly speaking.